Claire Evans and David Carter were once the picture of young love, she, the bright-eyed dreamer with a camera in hand, and he, the charming mechanic who promised forever. But behind the smiles and whispered promises, their story twisted into something darker, a descent from first love into deadly obsession. What began as romance would end in betrayal, disappearance, and a murder that shocked an entire town. Claire Evans grew up in the kind of town where nothing ever seemed to change. Rows of modest houses lined quiet streets, and neighbors waved from porches as children rode their bikes until the sun dipped low. For Claire, the town was both a comfort and a cage. She dreamed of leaving, of photographing landscapes beyond the hills that surrounded her. She carried her camera everywhere, filling memory cards with snapshots of everyday life, sunlight filtering through trees, reflections in the river, laughter caught mid-breath. To those who knew her, Claire seemed destined for something brighter than the small place she came from. It was in the middle of summer, during a local music festival that filled the park with food stalls and live bands, that she met David Carter. He was older only by a couple of years, but he carried himself with a confidence that caught Claire's attention. His hands were rough from working long hours at his uncle's garage, his grin wide, his energy magnetic. He noticed her taking photos near the stage and asked her to snap one of him and his friends. From that moment, he didn't drift far from her side. The festival stretched into late evening, music rising into the star-filled sky. Claire, usually shy, felt strangely comfortable with him. David spoke with ease, telling her stories about fixing cars and late-night drives along the back roads. There was something thrilling about the way he looked at her, like she was the only person who mattered in that crowded park. By the end of the night, they shared their numbers, and David promised he'd call. Within days, the two were inseparable. Their relationship unfolded quickly, the kind that friends described as a whirlwind. Claire posted photos of their outings, her leaning against his truck, the two of them smiling at the riverbank, long captions about how lucky she felt. Her parents noticed the glow in her eyes when she talked about him. To outsiders, it seemed like young love at its purest, full of firsts and excitement. But underneath the bliss, subtle signs began to show. David liked to know where she was at all times, insisting it was just because he cared. When she was late replying to his texts, he grew restless, sometimes showing up at her house unannounced. At first, Claire brushed it off as passion. She told herself he was simply protective, and perhaps, in a way, it made her feel valued. He had a way of apologizing with flowers or long drives that made it easy to forgive. Despite the occasional unease, she poured herself into the relationship. She spoke of him as though he was part of her future, a figure she imagined standing beside her as she pursued her dreams. Friends teased that they were the couple of the town, their photos and outings almost too perfect. Claire believed that what they had was rare, the kind of love people searched a lifetime to find. She couldn't see yet that perfection was only what sat on the surface, and that something darker, quieter, had already begun to grow beneath. By the time the leaves began to turn, the energy between Claire and David no longer felt the same. What had started as playful teasing began to carry an edge. David's questions about where she had been or who she had spoken to grew sharper, as if every answer needed to be proven. Claire found herself explaining small details of her day, things she had never thought twice about before. If she lingered till long after class or spent an evening editing her photographs, she could feel his irritation simmering beneath the surface. He wanted her time, all of it, and he wanted it without question. Claire's friends noticed first. During group outings, David hovered, always within earshot, rarely giving her the space to laugh and talk freely. When she drifted away to snap photos, he followed. If a classmate complimented her work, he folded his arms and grew quiet. She told her closest friend one afternoon that David's moods confused her. One moment, he was the same boy who made her laugh at the river. The next, he turned cold and silent, punishing her with long stretches of disapproval until she apologized for things she didn't fully understand. Her parents began to see small changes too. Claire no longer talked as openly at dinner. She was distracted, often glancing at her phone, waiting for his messages. If one didn't arrive quickly enough, she looked unsettled. When they asked about him, she brushed away their concerns with a soft smile, saying he was just protective, that he cared too much sometimes. Yet even in those reassurances, there was hesitation, a trace of unease that she tried to hide. The closer she came to her college interviews, the more pressure seemed to build. She had dreamed of leaving for years, of exploring new places with her camera, but David treated the idea like betrayal. He told her there was no reason to leave when she had everything she needed in town. His words wrapped around her like a chain. He insisted she would regret it, that people out there couldn't possibly love her the way he did. At first, she tried to reassure him, promising that their relationship could survive the distance. But the more she spoke about her future, the more his silence turned to resentment. Claire found herself trapped between two worlds. In one, she was the bright, ambitious girl with dreams too big for her small town. In the other, she was David's girlfriend, bound by the intensity of his love and the fear of losing him. She convinced herself that maybe things would change, that once he adjusted to her plans, his warmth would return. The memories of their first summer together lingered, and she clung to them as proof that the man she loved was still there. But the cracks widened. His car began appearing outside her house late at night, headlights off, engine idling. He claimed he only wanted to make sure she was safe, but she could feel the weight of his watchfulness pressing down on her freedom. What had once felt like devotion now felt like control. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. She told herself it was only a rough patch, one that all couples must face. Deep down, though, an uneasiness had already taken root, one that whispered a truth she was not yet ready to hear. The night Claire disappeared began like any other. The air was crisp, the ground covered in the brittle crunch of fallen leaves. She told her parents she was meeting David at the riverbank, the place that had once been the backdrop to their happiest memories. They remembered the soft excitement in her voice when she left, a quiet hope that maybe the evening would ease the tension that had been building between them. She promised she would be home by 10. Hours passed. The house grew still, but Claire never returned. At first, her parents thought she had lost track of time. When midnight came and the silence stretched longer, unease began to settle in. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Messages were left unread. By morning, fear had taken the place of patience, and her parents reported her missing. The search began almost immediately. Claire's car was found parked near the river, doors locked but keys left in the ignition. Inside, her bag and camera were untouched. The scene looked abandoned, as if she had stepped out only for a moment. Her phone, however, was nowhere to be found. Volunteers combed the riverbank and the surrounding woods, their voices calling her name as dogs searched for her scent. But the trail went cold within a few hundred yards. Detectives turned to David, the last person Claire had said she was going to meet. He told them she never arrived that night. His tone was steady, almost to controlled, as he repeated the same account to every officer. He said he had waited for her, but when she didn't show, he assumed she had changed her mind. On the surface, it sounded simple, yet small details raised suspicion. There were scratches across his forearm, thin lines that looked fresh. Mud clung to the edges of his shoes despite the dry weather that week. His truck, usually cluttered with tools and spare parts, had been scrubbed clean. Friends told police that the couple had been fighting more often. They spoke of David's growing jealousy, his late-night appearances outside Claire's house. One friend recalled how Claire admitted she was thinking about ending the relationship, though she never found the courage to follow through. Detectives listened carefully, noting how these stories painted a very different picture than the one David offered. Despite their suspicions, there was no proof. Without a body, without clear evidence of foul play, the investigation slowed. Days turned into weeks. Flyers bearing Claire's smiling face were taped to storefronts and pinned to bulletin boards. Candlelight vigils filled the town square, neighbors holding each other as prayers were whispered into the night. Still, there was no sign of her. David continued with his life, though his composure unsettled many. While others searched and mourned, he was seen in public acting as though nothing had changed. His calmness, once a charm, now carried the shadow of something colder. Investigators watched closely, but with every day that passed without discovery, the truth of what had happened to Claire seemed to drift further out of reach, hidden in the silence of that November night. Winter was setting in when the case finally broke open. Weeks had dragged by without answers, the cold air filling the town with a heavy silence. Then, on a quiet December morning, a hunter moving through the woods stumbled on something that caught his attention, a scrap of fabric snagged on a low branch, torn and weathered, its color faded but still recognizable. It was pale blue, the same shade Claire had been wearing on the night she disappeared. Uneasy, the hunter searched the area further and noticed disturbed earth a few feet away. Soil clumped unnaturally, as though it had been hastily turned and pressed back into place. He called the police immediately. When investigators arrived, the ground was carefully examined. Within hours, the shallow grave revealed itself. Beneath layers of dirt and fallen leaves, wrapped in a jacket that still carried her perfume, lay the remains of Claire Evans. The search that had haunted the town for weeks had finally come to a tragic end. Officers secured the area, their radios crackling with the news that spread quickly across the community. The autopsy provided chilling details. Claire had suffered multiple blows to the head, the injuries consistent with a blunt object. There were no signs she had tried to escape. The strikes had been sudden, violent, and final. The medical examiner estimated her death had occurred the very night she vanished. What had once been whispered suspicions hardened into certainty. This was no accident, no disappearance by choice. It was murder. Detectives immediately turned their focus back to David Carter. His earlier calmness now seemed calculated. While the town grieved, he had already begun moving on, appearing in public with another young woman only weeks after Claire's disappearance. To investigators, this was not the behavior of someone consumed by heartbreak, it was the behavior of someone attempting to bury the past. Along with his victim, forensic teams descended on his truck. Soil samples taken from the wheel wells and undercarriage matched the unique composition of the dirt from the burial site. The evidence grew stronger when Claire's blood was discovered beneath the rubber mat on the passenger side. The stain had been scrubbed at, but trace amounts remained, enough to connect the vehicle directly to her death. Detectives pieced together the sequence of events. They believed Claire had met David at the river just as she had planned. An argument likely erupted, fueled by her growing determination to live her own life. At some point, anger boiled over. The blows were struck, leaving her lifeless by the water's edge. In a hurried attempt to conceal the crime, David transported her body to the woods, burying her in shallow earth and cleaning his truck in a desperate effort to erase the evidence. News of the discovery shattered the community. Vigils turned to memorials, and posters pleading for Claire's safe return were quietly taken down. The town that had once hoped for a miracle now faced the reality of a brutal truth. Beneath the surface of young love, jealousy had festered into something monstrous, leaving behind a trail that could no longer be hidden. The trial of David Carter began the following spring, drawing crowds of townspeople and reporters who packed the courthouse each day. The story had already spread far beyond the small community where it happened, a tragic tale of young love turned violent. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting their case. They laid out the timeline with precision, Claire leaving home to meet David, her car abandoned by the river, the discovery of her body in the woods, and the forensic evidence tying David's truck to the burial site. Each detail was methodically presented, each piece of evidence reinforcing the picture of a crime born from obsession and rage. The jury listened as experts took the stand. A forensic soil analyst explained how the dirt from David's tires and undercarriage contained the same mineral composition as the soil at the burial site, a match so specific it could not be coincidence. A blood expert testified about the traces of Claire's blood found beneath the floor mat of his truck, remnants that had survived even after someone tried to scrub the vehicle clean. The medical examiner described the blows to Claire's head in quiet, clinical detail, explaining how they left her with no chance of survival. The courtroom grew still as those words sank in. The defense attempted to push back, suggesting that the evidence was circumstantial. They argued that soil could have transferred in other ways, that the blood might have been from an earlier injury, and that no one had witnessed the crime directly. They painted David as a grieving young man whose actions after Claire's disappearance had been misinterpreted. But as the trial unfolded, it became clear that the weight of evidence was too strong. Claire's family sat through every session, their faces marked by grief but also by determination. They listened as her private life was dissected and her final hours reconstructed. For them, the trial was not just about justice, but about ensuring her story was fully told. Friends gave statements about her dreams of college, her passion for photography, and the way she had confided her growing unease with David's behavior. Their testimonies brought Claire back to life inside the courtroom, reminding everyone that she was more than a case file, more than evidence presented on a screen. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the jury was sent to deliberate. The town held its breath as hours turned into a day and then into two. When the jurors finally returned, their verdict was firm, guilty of second-degree murder. David Carter showed little emotion as the sentence was read, his expression unreadable. He was given life in prison, a future spent behind bars instead of the life he had once imagined with Claire. The aftermath of the trial left the town forever changed. A scholarship was created in Claire's name, supporting young women who dreamed of pursuing their education and careers at her memorial. People spoke not only of her kindness and creativity, but also of the dangers of mistaking control for love. Her story became a warning, a reminder that devotion can turn destructive when fueled by jealousy and fear. In the end, what remained was both the tragedy of a life cut short and the resilience of a community determined to honor her memory.